Hi everyone and our audience. Welcome to the jungle. Today we're going to be talking a lot about all things succulent. Now, although they are kind of labeled the easiest plant we carry in our store, they do have a lot of tips and tricks that I hope to talk about with you guys today. And they do get a misconception for being easy, and they generally are. However, just like any house plant or any outdoor plant, they do have their specific needs. And I hope I can really get one-on-one with you guys to talk a little bit about that. So first off, what is a succulent? Why is it different from other houseplants? Well, succulents have this unique adaptation to where they either store a lot of excess water in both their stems or their leaves. So we can see this swollen caliform adenium or desert rose. It stores most of its water in leaves. Meanwhile, the succulents such as like the Hoyas or the really common Epiphylums that people like store it much more in their leaves. And why do they do this? Well, they grow in very harsh climates, lots of heat, lots of sun. They do it to store all that water that they can't get in the sparser months of the year. So, we'll dig in deep a little bit about everything you see on the table, some of the more tropical ones you see over here, as well as the outdoor kind of staples. And I want to just talk a little bit about everything we have. So, for starters, succulents often get the reputation that they're this really, really great houseplant. The truth is they're really not. They need a lot of light actually, lots of sun, and sometimes people squirrel them away in shaded areas inside their home, and that just simply does not work for them. I have actually an example over here. You'll start off kind of seeing a plant stretch out and get flatter and flatter over time. So when we put a succulent in shade, the first sign is a lack of coloration and what we call etiolation. That's etiolated growth, and the leaves either lengthen or flatten out. So that's a really good sign to see whether or not your succulent is even best suitable for indoors. They really, in my opinion, should remain outdoors. I'm going to tell you exactly how to take care of them outdoors, because even out there's some nuances. But I do kind of want to preface the fact that yes, you can grow succulents indoors. However, I would almost always recommend to keep them outside 9 times out of 10, unless you have a really, really, really sunny window with 6 hours or more light that's also relatively warm. They can struggle long term. Now, that's not to say they will. Oh, Frank?
Sorry, when you say outside, outdoor, do you really mean like shaded outdoor or like full sun?
Well, I'll get to that. So some plants, like the agaves you see here, they are tolerant of that full, hot afternoon sun. A lot of them do really want to be protected. So when I say outdoors, I don't necessarily always mean full sun. The best way to grow a lot of these, especially more sensitive succulents, like this is a really interesting kalanchoe we have here, I usually at home when I'm growing them, try to protect them from sun after around 1 o'clock. So the second the sun comes up, I want them in the brightest morning light I can possibly find. Or if it's in the afternoon sun, make sure it's kind of under a canopy. So, if you have a shaded part of your house shades into a direction past around 2 o'clock, that's perfect, because as you know, our California afternoon sun is pretty brutal and incredibly hot again. I actually have an example. Really quickly burn up plants. And although succulents are heat tolerant, they aren't necessarily full sun tolerant. Second you start pushing those boundaries of full sun, they only have a thin layer of skin. Just like us, we get sunburned, the plants get sunburned. So now there are succulents that do handle full sun better than others, like agaves. These are some of our American natives, Texas, Arizona. They get beat up with 120 degrees, 108 degrees all day long. Now all the Echeverias, that's going to be these guys right here. They're from usually South Africa. We have Dudleas here, very similar looking, but they're coastal lying succulents. So maybe they'll do great in the Bay Area where we have that coastal fog. But here, I'd say the second it starts getting above 85, 90, 95 each day, make sure those are really only living around, morning sun. And if you don't have if you don't have great morning sun, you can put them in a really hot, sunny area, and you can use shade cloth, or you can just find, even plant a tree that gives you a nice light canopy. I like succulents a lot personally. As kind of a canopy underdweller, so I have a big sycamore tree, it's about 60 feet. I have tons of succulents planted on the base of it, because although that tree is in full sun, it's filtered the light a lot. And what succulents do best in long term is filter light. Now, another thing about succulents and sun is it's very, very important to give them that light, otherwise they will lose their coloration. Now, I see it often in our corporate accounts. We have plants that go in offices, and again, I don't recommend these plants really as house plants or office plants unless you have a lot of sun. But I see just in a matter of weeks or months, like this guy has, believe it or not, only really been in the back of our shop. Back there it's a little darker for about 2-3 weeks. Started off as this beautiful bright pink, but without that sun, the plants don't get the coloration they really want or need. So I guess I'm going to take a quick break, and do you have any questions on that? Yeah.
Sorry, another good question. You talk about sun, so what about winter time that you need to move them around or?
Well, if the spot that was once in sun is now shaded due to the direction of the sun shifting, you are going to want to move them. But I'd say a general rule of thumb is that make sure they are at least getting 6 hours of like filtered light. Now, if they have really, really good direct light, you could do about 4. But they do, some varieties again tolerate sun, and some even tolerate a certain amount of shade. It's just also getting to know your variety too. Like Echeverias, what I'm kind of talking about as a normality are all like the, what you kind of see in here, this little grouping of plants, the more common internet-looking succulents. Those are the ones that are typically fall under these conditions. Now again, we have plants like the agaves, or they can handle sun all day long. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have tropical succulents like Hoyas. Those are South Asian plants. They really need to be indoors because it's too cold or too frosty entirely altogether. So each plant kind of has its different needs. And succulents are such a diverse group with over 60 different families. Not God knows how many species. They all have their own little niche environments that they could go in. But generally speaking, as long as you're referring to these plants we kind of have here, they all fall under that. I'd say 6 hours of bright indirect light. And again, afternoon sun, kind of a danger zone. That's when you really want to be protecting them. You have a question?
Like I planted, have you been to Croyona International Market? They have succulent garden. We planted rocks and lots of Euphorbia and agaves and ponytail. And some of them are a little bit shaded with a tree, and others are exposed to full sun all day long, but they're doing well and spreading. And so as long as it gets enough light, enough water in summer sun, you need to water like every day, right? They do fine. Amazingly, they take a lot of water in the full sun.
Yeah, and if you water them frequently, like she's saying, you could usually get by with placing some of them in full sun. But we do, like, again, there are Echeverias that are stronger varieties than others. Now, this is an Echeveria that's been watered regularly the way you're supposed to water it, but it was just in too much sun and completely flattened out and burned. So a lot of it does have to do with the variety itself. One plant that I always see is a good indicator for handling sun. Second, you start seeing either gray or like the gray powdery plants or really fuzzy ones. So the trichomes act as like our hair. We use it again to protect our skin. The plants do the same reason. So if you see a really fuzzy succulent, those oftentimes are much more tolerant than just the thin, like colored ones. And again, same thing with the white. If you find a really thick white powder on them, that's like the plant sunscreen. So those are going to be the varieties you really can start playing with in full sun. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of one of the ways you should what you should look out for when growing them outdoors. Another thing you do need to be mindful of is watering. Now, like Kahumi said, you can water them a lot more in the summertime. The trick with that is it usually has to almost do with drainage. You're going to start killing them by overwatering them when you give them a poor soil. Now, that's where kind of picking a potting soil comes into play. What I use in the store, I actually make our own mix. A lot of places you'll see sell like a standard cactus soil. Now that's pretty good, but again, if you're trying to water your plants more to keep them alive in those hot months and you don't want to think about it too much, I really consider amending it, because the straight up cactus mix does, believe it or not, actually retain a fair amount of moisture. That cactus mix they also use for palm trees and citrus trees, so it's a good starting point, but it's the additives that really will help it for a daily watering. Also, in the winter, when you're getting rainfall that's not up to you, you can risk rotting your plants. So you don't want to overwater your succulents in the winter months. So what you want to do is create a balanced soil that has a lot of substrate or rock, kind of similar to the environments where they actually grow from, to prevent that root rot. And what I do is I add, this is kind of like a bad example, but it's normally 40, 20, 20, 20. There's 20% crushed red lava, 20% pumice, and then I have 20% perlite. And you can kind of, red lava rock I really like. Sometimes hard to find, so you could usually substitute it with pumice, very similar. And frankly, any combination of these soil, again, you do want to do a little bit over half of it with a rockier substrate. Then the mix itself, that gives you that nice drainage, that gives you leeway to be able to water it every day, honestly, or more often than you would with the thick. Like when I look at some of these plants, this is in a pretty heavy peat mix, and sometimes I'll find I can almost squeeze water out of it because it retains so much moisture. Succulents in the wintertime, that's almost a death sentence. So when I'm repotting or when I'm making arrangements for people, I always really try to rock up that mix. Any quick questions?
Questions.
Sorry,
Yeah.
you ask. Then you would suggest planting in a pot, but you mentioned you're doing it out on the ground as well. So in that instance, you prepare the soil first, but winter time when you water, that's still okay?
Well, we will definitely reduce the irrigation, like the amount of water that goes out. And in the rain, you hardly have to water.
But especially when planting outdoors here, the soil is usually very heavy in clay, really tough. Clay almost acts like a bowl. So you can dig a little hole, except all that clay is just going to trap the moisture on the base. So when I'm doing it, and if I'm actually doing a landscape planning, I start really going nuts with pumice. Like pumice is a really great aerator. And I've seen a lot of people with succulent yards die out just because they're like, oh, I'll plant the succulents in the ground, they're so tough. Second that heavy rain and that frost comes around, you can lose almost half, if not all. And I've seen entire Echeveria gardens completely gone. And another thing, I know we're not quite into winter yet, but we're closing in on it. Now, if you have, again, a protected patio, you have them kind of in pots above the ground, usually they're almost overall fine when it comes to frost. However, if you have big gardens of these tender South African succulents, you really are going to want to consider using frost cloth or just some way to protect them during those especially cold nights, because your succulents are very susceptible to the cold as well. So that's one thing you do want to really take into consideration these next couple of months, especially closing in January, December, even November. Most of the time they pull through, despite the frost. You might be down to a little stump, but it'll grow back. However, why you have a stump when you could actually keep the entire plant alive?
Yeah. And you separated this section and that section.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little more?
Yeah, so I do want to talk a little bit about the indoor succulents. Now, again, I mentioned earlier, succulents are kind of lousy indoor plants. That doesn't mean you can't grow them inside, and there are all sorts of really interesting varieties that a lot of people and succulent collectors try to get their hands on, however, want to throw them outside and they can't grow because, again, the frost, the sun, it's all too hot or too cold. Like you can see, this is the beautiful string of hearts. It's a really interesting trailing succulent. And that's a plant that can grow outside during the summer, but second those nights get below 55, and if it's in too much sun, you almost always lose it. Second at 55, it's as good as dead. They don't really like going below 55, 50, 45. 45 is the death sentence. 55, they could usually hold up. But this would be more of a much better house plant. So again, really bright light still, but doesn't need to be outdoors the way these guys need it. Hoyas are a really popular house plant. People love them. I love them. I'm a big collector of them, actually. Another great example of an indoor succulent. Again, you could kind of give them that option outdoors in the summertime and the spring, but second you start getting below those 45-degree temperatures at night, that is when I'd move them in. And they are a really interesting, kind of way to, if you're new to houseplants, you want to experiment into getting into them. These are what I call like an enabler plant. You start with one of these, and next thing you know, you have 80 houseplants. But they're a really easy, tough tropical succulent. And a lot of people sometimes are confused about the idea of a tropical succulent, but the truth is succulents grow on just about every continent other than Antarctica. There's the ones in Asia, there's ones in Africa, like the snake plant. Again, really common plant, might not even know it's a succulent, but it follows all the characteristics of a succulent. Thick, succulent-like leaves that store water. Again, it's adapted this way to tolerate a much harsher, hotter climate. But again, really, really easy houseplant. And Kahumi just put out one of our other Hoyas. This is one of our rare ones, but it's called a Hoya Croyona. They get really cute little delicate flowers. Might be hard to see on the camera over there. But another really interesting group of tropical succulents. And I do have a couple other ones here. Believe it or not, these are one that kind of brink on the edge of danger of keeping them alive in the winter. A lot of people try to grow them outside. These are called Epiphylums. They're actually not succulents. Believe it or not, they're a tropical cactus, but very similar care to succulents, and a lot of people kind of misclassify them, but it's another great succulent that you can kind of grow indoors. And again, same rules as these guys, lots of sun when inside, but really interesting group of plants. This is actually an outdoor plant, but it's a beautiful string of bananas. So I wanted to just kind of show off all the different looks you have to succulents. You can have trailing, you could have the rosettes, which are what everyone knows them by. There are plants such as caudiforms. That's what this one is with the trunk on it. So succulents have all sorts of different shapes and sizes as well.
This is a string of ruby necklace, and in the full sun it turns really purple. Beautiful.
And speaking of color change, one thing that I find really fascinating about succulents is you see some of their best colors actually in the winter if they're protected right. That cold snap releases a whole bunch of anthocyanins, which is coloration pigment. So some of these, like this is an interesting little bright, green and yellow aeonium. However, the second that winter frost comes, and it gets that cold snap, you get an extreme charge in color. And you see that especially with the fire sticks. However, as much as I love that plant for the winter color, I've seen it rot out year after year after year after year from just being overwatered. And again, it's one of the ones where you have to, and I mean have to frost pot them in the winter until they're, about 5-7 feet, and then they strengthen out a little bit. Same thing with this cool Madagascan palm. This is an example of a Euphorbia. Euphorbias are, they're not necessarily succulents, but are often grouped in. You kind of see this guy right here. A quick little lesson about euphorbias. Everyone thinks euphorbia and cacti are the same. Let me try to find my two examples right here. Now, they're kind of interesting since they grow on very different ends of the planet. Now, cacti we have in the Americas. Euphorbia, again, they both live in very harsh desert climates. However, the euphorbias are from Africa, so complete opposite side of the world. I don't have great examples since we don't have that much of a selection of the two in the shop right now. But often people are like, oh my gosh, that looks like a weird little cactus. Or that's, this is obviously not a succulent but a cactus. But these are, believe it or not, two completely different families of plants. So kind of an interesting example of convergent evolution. Two plants that look very similar, have adapted in the same climates, but are complete different sides of the hemisphere. So, any questions before I move on to the next bit? Now, one thing that I get asked all the time is, how do I propagate my succulent? Now, it's actually really easy in my opinion. They're one of the most, as far as a shareable plant, these are probably the most shareable plants you could have. You could propagate from a leaf, you could propagate from a pup, you could propagate the entire head off. So I did make a little demo. It's not like it's too intuitive. However, there's several different ways you can go about propagating them. The simplest way is just through a leaf. Now, you could kind of poke them down like I did here, but all you really have to do is find your plant, peel off the leaf, make sure it's not really torn, but popped right off. You have a little, you'll see a kind of a center axis or pole, kind of a vein, that you're going to either want to prop right above the soil, just to where it's touching the ground a little bit, or you could even poke it straight down. Again, almost one of the easiest plants to root from leaf, so it's not too hard to do. But, so that's one way. You can just propagate from a leaf, poke it in about 3 months you start seeing a little baby rosette come up from that leaf. And you see little roots trail down. Now, you can't just put the leaves straight in soil. What I always do is typically I let them callus over for 2-3 days. I plop them, make sure that end's not fleshy and wet to the touch, and dry out, and that is when I'm going to place it in the dirt. Now, again, succulents are very easily propagatable. And another thing they often do is what I call, or most people will refer to as pupping. So they pup, they have a little baby at the base. Some plants have it on the sides, like you can see this guy, branch out. But the whole idea is just making a clone of itself, or a duplicate. So when I'm trying to propagate a pup, pretty easy, you can cut it. Or what I do is just pinch it off lightly, and same thing, just stick it in the dirt and, wait for it to callus 2 to 3 days, and then stick it in the dirt. And then what I usually do is just keep the soil a little bit moist. So not where it's soggy, but just kind of evenly moist once a week. That way that little base of the plant has these, can send out roots that are water seeking. So I did in the glass. Again, you're normally going to want drainage, but in the glass you can kind of monitor that growth. But pupping is one of the best ways to propagate these little plants. And another thing to do is, let's say you have an arrangement and your succulent is getting egregiously large, and you maybe want the nice little baby plants again. What I'll also do is just snap off the entire head. And I do want a clean cut, so usually we'll go back and cut that stem at a 45-degree angle, right beneath or above one of these nodes. These nodes are where a lot of the roots send out from. So a broken cut, again, usually they make it, but it's best just to be professional about it. And you're going to cut at a 45-degree angle, just like that. And same thing like the pups, just stick it right back down into the dirt. So if you have a plant, often I do that when my plants are getting either too long, too big, and I want that nice little compact look that succulents are so great for. And, second you cut off that head, what's that plant going to do? It's going to want to send up all these little babies. So if you through those babies, you could either propagate again, or you can keep one of those little babies to replace that main plant. Like one thing we've done in the past are these Succulent Reeds. There's one fake one by the register. But those are the fastest things to grow out of cohorts really quickly. They get all wonky and weird. And I always cut the heads off. And now you have to wait 3 to 4 months before they look really good again. But it's better than having them leggy and spindly and winding all over the place. Questions? Yeah.
Just when you cover all the topics, have you found any success in propagating with seeds?
I have. I'm an impatient person.
Okay.
So succulents and cacti especially do take 2 to 5 years to get a really decent plant. Now one plant I did propagate quite successfully from seed are lithops, the little brain butt looking one, baby toes. Those are actually really satisfying because they take about 6 months to get a little plant out of. But typically when I'm propagating from seed, I'm going to want a mix a little more sandy and rocky than this. So I usually throw in some sand, very, very sterile, where just the seeds can kind of wedge themselves in, not get really lost and watered down into the soil. And then seeds, for whatever reason, don't mind that extra humidity. So what I'll do when I'm seeding succulents, I rarely do this because I'm impatient, but you get a little sandwich bag and you can trap those succulents in kind of a moist, humid environment, and that's the fastest way to get them to take the seed. But it is a waiting game, and what's nice about succulents is usually the leaf does the job a lot faster. But if you're looking for something really weird that you can't find anywhere else, the seed might be the way to go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But those leaf ones, you propagate them that way, but what about the string ones? We've got string of pearl that I'm trying to do. So
well, interesting enough, the pearl itself is actually just an inflamed, swollen up leaf. So you could just grab that you see the little part where I ripped it out, stick that straight down, and that will eventually send out a trail. Again, the simpler way of doing it, just taking a cutting and peeling off that last leaf. You see the little node, and pushing that down into the soil. And string of hearts, or not string of hearts, but like the string of pearls, they're one of the ones that can tolerate a little bit more humidity. So as long as they're not soggy, you could try the sandwich bag technique and they probably will root a lot faster for you. So, and unfortunately, there are plants kind of like, the agaves, they're a little harder to propagate. If you start cutting them in weird ways, all their leaves fall off and then you kill your plant. Not all succulents will propagate from a leaf. Like this is a catiform, so a very trunk-like succulent. This guy's actually in, plumerias, Hawaiian plumeria family. So it won't it won't ever root from a leaf. However, you can do a stem cutting, and I'm going to do a cleaner cut. And again, just like that top head, you gut below the node, and eventually, in 2 or 3 months, you have some roots, and you have your full new little clothes. Plants like this, again, the only way you can actually really propagate it is 1, if it pops. 2, sometimes you can cut the head off and you reroot that, and you'll get a whole bunch of new little active growth off these spiky, nasty nodes. But different plants have different ways to propagate. Yeah.
So we have one of those snake plants.
Mhm.
It looks horrible compared to yours. That looks really nice.
Yeah.
What are we doing wrong?
Well, they could tolerate, they're one of our plants that we say could tolerate just like those easy 100 days without light or water. Now, I think in the most optimal conditions, give them kind of a filtered, medium, moderate light. They don't need a lot. They could tolerate full sun, they could tolerate shade a lot better than our other plants, but the trick with them is usually what I see people doing wrong with them is overwatering and loving them too much. In the shop, we water them once every 2 weeks. I have a big one at my house. It's in probably a 12-inch pot. I think between like Christmas, or no, it wasn't Christmas, it was like Thanksgiving and like January 16th, I didn't water it the entire time. So in the winter, you really have to pull back on watering, otherwise you could risk rotting them out. But often, my guess is your mistake is overwater.
Yeah, because since we've gotten it, it's been about a year. It's probably grown like 2 to 3 leaves.
Mm-hmm.
And we usually stick our hands in there to see if it's still moist,
Mhm.
like really deep in the dirt. And for the most part, it tends to not dry out as quickly. So
Yeah.
maybe it's just the fact that it's not really in.
You could let them almost become bone dry.
Yeah.
And you don't have to. You can water them a little more frequently, but in the shop we don't, because you'll start risking getting crispy tips. But less water is always the solution. In fact, we have a tech here who works for us that has been guilty of overwatering since
The
1991.
better the light,
Yeah.
the more they
Better
can
the light.
handle. But in the low light, you can wait.
Yeah.
I was also just going to say too, like a lot of different shops like the Home Depot, they'll put in very organic soil just really quickly. So if that's the case too, I always like to pot up with a good mix of like cactus soil and amend it with perlites, which is very light and airy. So you can water it more
Yeah.
often, but you don't run the risk of it like rotting on your product.
Yeah, in my greenhouse, all my succulents are pretty much potted up in I usually do about, rather than this much soil, I'd say, 50% lava rock, 20% pumice, and the rest soil. So that way I can get by with watering them pretty much whenever I want to. And again, succulents won't die if you don't water them for a while, which is kind of nice about them. You can't give a pothos a really rocky mix and just be like, oh, well, I only want to water you today and wait 7 days, it's going to dry out. Succulents, when they dry out, don't mind it at all. And that's what I love about having a rockier mix, is it kind of gives you a little more freedom to water them. So it's never you can underwater succulents. It takes a little bit of practice, you really have to be neglecting them or again throwing them in that outside full sun environment. But usually when they're protected under a patio, they're shaded, it's filtered, you're not going to risk drying them out unless you wait almost like a month, 2 months.
Fertilization.
Well, I personally don't fertilize succulents. I change their mix, usually soil, especially cactus mix. When you buy it at the store, it usually has some worm castings or organic compost. Now, if you have them growing in your backyard and you don't want to dig them up, you can throw some worm castings or compost on them. That usually adds a little bit of fertilizer. But succulents aren't really fertilizer-heavy plants. One thing I did forget to talk about was the issues with pests on succulents. unlike a lot of our houseplants, succulents can be very, very sensitive to miticides, needs, and different oils that you treat them with. And again, a succulent's only really going to get mites if, one, you introduced a new plant to the colony that has tons of mites. Typically outside you don't see them that much until you start giving those plants those starved conditions. When it's in too low of light or doing really poorly, that's when I start seeing the mites take over. A healthy plant, more often than not, won't even attract them. But when treating mites, especially on succulents, I usually do I think it's like a 70% water and 30% isopropyl alcohol, and I just do a little bit of a spray to kill those mealybugs, spider mites, and that's usually the trick with mites on these guys. And now, if the plant is infested, often I just say throw it out, especially if it's really bad. I had a beautiful multi-headed cactus, bright pink, interesting plant, but it was completely covered in scale. There is something to say, like, I should probably just kill this plant to save the rest. And unfortunately with succulents that can sometimes happen, especially oftentimes people throw their succulents in arrangements like this. When you have them that close to each other, that's when you're going to risk getting mites. And a sick plant is it's more worth throwing out, trying to treat the ones that have less than saving it and using all your resources and time trying to figure that one out. So, I guess I don't have too much more for you, but if you have any questions or have plants of your own you're worried about, I'm happy to discuss them. Yeah.
So I'm kind of more curious about the Euphorbias, especially because they had that milky-like substance to them, and whenever I swear I've tried maybe like a dozen times to try to propagate it, and it just doesn't work well. Is there any tips you have?
Well, again, I'm going to try to get it, whenever I propagate something like this guy, I have noticed it's one of the more finicky ones to propagate. I'm going to try to cut it really as close to the base of the stem as possible. And frankly, it's almost better to just slightly twist it off. A big thing is letting them callus over for a couple days. Euphorbias you can kind of almost put on their side, let them dry out for about a week. Maybe even 2 before you stick them in, but it's not always necessarily a guaranteed chance. I usually put 5 or 6 in a pot. That way I usually at least have 1 or 2 that come out. But if you do kind of one at a time propagation, you might be saddened by the results. And that kind of goes with any of these. Now, the leaves are probably the most effective way to go with the regular succulents, but they don't always stick. So sometimes it's good to do a dozen or 9. I've seen people, they'll have the entire shape of their succulent and they just ripped off every single leaf and kind of planted them in a ring so it looks all pretty in the pot while you're propagating it. But with Euphorbias especially, it's just a matter of getting a really clean, sterile cut. And second, you start using those really more organic soils, you're going to risk rotting it out. So when I do Euphorbia, it's really, really rocky. Start upping the concentration of the pumice or the lava rock. Perlite isn't my favorite as far as sterile mixes. It's kind of powdery. It usually sinks. So pumice would be the one that could go for that one. Sure. Jonathan? Nope. Okay. He's going to give me an event calendar. But talking about a few events I know off the top of my head, this Friday I'm actually, we are very well known for our actual live plant workshop. I'm teaching a succulent paint night this Friday, so if you want to paint instead of plant, it's I think $45 a ticket, 50 with drinks. So that's happening this Friday from 6 to 8, so I'm going to be talking about painting plants, and we'll have a whole bunch of pretty succulents to look at and paint. We've done so many plant workshops where we've kind of gone through our cycle too many times and we threw something in. So that's going to be a fun little date night. If you know anyone who wants to paint, come on in, 6 to 8. Following that, on Saturday, we're having a big plant auction. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen our tent. Some of those plants look a little sadder than the ones in the shop, don't they? So we have a fun auction planned where people can come in and actually bid for those big plants but at really cheap prices. And of course, we're going to throw in some more interesting rare plants as well, some arrangements. So it's going to have all sorts of different things. Following next month, it's going to be October. We're having our 49th anniversary party. We're having our shop hours from 10 to 2 and our party hours from 2 to 6. So we're going to be having food, games, really good sales and discounts, and that's going to be on 29th of October, and then on the 30th, we are having a pumpkin arrangement class from $15 to $35, and we're going to be doing a little succulent arrangement over a pumpkin. So it's not going to be a really long-lasting arrangement. However, it's fun for the holidays, and especially Halloween. And that's really all we have next month. And do come in because it's going to actually be a good sale, since it's going to be 31% off your second plant. It's October 31st. It's Halloween, 31% off. Yeah. And that is all I have for you guys today. So again, if you have questions, please ask.